Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Zach Rausch. Zach is an assistant research scientist at NYU and the lead researcher for a new fascinating book called The Anxious Generation, written by Jonathan Haidt. Zach, welcome to the show.
Nick, thank you for having me on. I'm thrilled to get to talk with you.
Yeah, appreciate you taking the time to be here. You know, this topic that we're going to discuss today, social media, is something that I've thought about many times over the last, 5 or 6 years, as an adult and just engaging with it myself, but also as a parent of young kids and thinking about the future. And when I saw this new book that you did the research for and supported the author on, I was super excited to check it out and have spent the last month or so kind of reading it and taking notes and excited to dive into it.
Yeah, me too. So where should we start?
Where should we begin? All right. So I guess a question, and maybe it might be hard for you to answer because you didn't write it, but one of the thoughts on my mind is, where did the impetus to write the book come from in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can't speak for John, but what I can kind of trace out here is that John had written The Coddling of the American Mind, which was another book published with a guy named Greg Lukianoff, who's the president of the Foundation of Individual Rights and Expression. And what they were set out to do was to try to understand, in part, why mental health among college students had really fallen apart after 2015 or so. And they traced the rise of depression and rise of other issues. And in the book, they lay out a bunch of different reasons for not only the mental health problems among college students, but also, why we were seeing new things like trigger warnings, safe spaces, all of these things emerging on college campuses very quickly. One of the reasons of a number was social media as a cause of the mental health problems among college students. And they weren't really sure. And then after the book was published, it got a ton of pushback. And people were like, well, we don't really know. It might be just, correlational. And so that set off years of us. This is really when I joined the team. And we were trying to understand, okay, just how much and if the social media is playing into the decline of mental health. And that's where we started. And then it just kept growing and growing and growing, where we realized it's not just college students. This is happening among adolescents. This is happening in the US. This is happening across social classes. This is happening in other countries around the world. And we just realized that this actually is a book in and of itself to try to understand why between the years of 2010 and 2015, the mental health of young people across many countries suddenly collapsed. And that's what the book is about.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard too that John, this is in one of his recent sort of public appearances, had mentioned that he was originally thinking of writing a book about the impact of social media on democracy, which I think is also a super interesting topic. Is that book still going to happen? Because I want to read that one too.
Hopefully John's media appearances is going to calm down so he can get back to writing. But I do think what you're saying is that actually this book, The Anxious Generation, was originally just the first chapter of a much bigger book. And that was about how digital life, especially social media, has made it so much harder for us to understand each other, to talk to each other, and ultimately the way that it's destabilizing liberal democracies in many areas around the world. And we were just going to start by talking about what's happening to kids. And again, once we started really working on that story, we realized that this is both a huge problem, much bigger than we realized. And second, that there is a lot that we can actually do to solve it, that when it comes to democracy is much harder. And so we're really putting our energy into this book because we believe there are real things that we can do, and it's happening now.
Yeah. Yeah. As I was taking my notes, I walked away, even though the story here is a negative one. It's more optimistic ultimately than many public policy issues that I've looked at, because there's actually some pretty easy and no brainer, basically free policy solutions, which is very rare when you're considering the landscape of politics and policy today. So we'll get into that later. But first
Yeah, yeah.
we got to get into the dark side of the story. So
Yes.
before we get into the research around kids, I just wanted to ask you about something, just maybe from whether it's research or from personal experience, because I feel like social media could be challenged for adults as well. Like, I consider myself to be like a reasonably disciplined person, and spend my days productively. And I've wrestled with social media uh, on many occasions. I've deleted it from my phone on occasions because I'll catch myself just going on to the apps, whether it's X or Instagram. Those are really the only two ones that I've ever messed around with. And then I realize that I'm feeling worse psychologically, like my internal state is bad, and I'm just wasting time. And I'm like, man, I don't need this garbage in my life. So I feel like, even though this is a book about kids, there's obviously a problem with adults as well. What is your take on that?
Um, I agree. The reason we focus on kids is, one, because they are particularly vulnerable to this stuff, and just in general, when we think about the impact of drugs, of other issues, we have a different frame of reference when we're talking about children and how we should treat that and think about that, and then what we do as adults and the kind of personal choices that we make. And so that was part of the reason why we really focus in on kids. And that's really where we're seeing the biggest changes in mental health. But I agree that these technologies are really both impacting us psychologically, but in a very deep way, very socially. And so one of our collaborators, she's an academic, Jean Twenge is her name. And she recently wrote a book called Generations, and she tracks the changes across all these different measures, from the baby boomers or even before them, all the way to Gen Alpha, who are the youngest kids alive today. And the key idea that she brings up, and I think it's really brilliant, is that for every new technology that comes into the world, it correspondingly increases the amount of individualism, how much we focus in on the self and away from our community. We're prioritizing the self. And in a lot of ways, that has led to a lot of great things. So we get ships, trains, airplanes. We can travel farther. We can do things that we couldn't do before. But what ends up happening is that we become more physically isolated, and our social thickness, the web of our connections, starts to weaken. And I believe that, with every new technology, from television to computers to internet to smartphones, ultimately the fabric that helps hold us together starts to disintegrate a bit. And I think that is one of the biggest things that's happening to adults is when we look at measures of adults with friends in the United States, it's about, I think, 15% of American men say they don't have any close friends. When we look at just levels of isolation and loneliness, death by despair, these are really the problems that many adults are facing. And I'm not saying it's entirely because of social media or technology, but it's a broader pattern of our long history of disconnecting from each other. And in part, that's what this book is trying to bring back, is that we, especially for kids, is that this virtual world composed of thousands and thousands of people, where networks, we have more shallow relationships, not deep-rooted community and play, is not a suitable place for kids to grow up. And so I think it impacts adults, and it also has real impacts on kids as well.
Yeah, that book sounds fascinating. I'm gonna have to check it out. I literally, like, the impetus for me doing this podcast is essentially a reaction to the exact same thing. I had never sort of thought about it in that particular frame, which is that maybe that it is directly related to technology. I was thinking it was more of like a historical process, but I've been almost every episode, this issue comes up about how in the world did we evolve this culture where basically everyone is out for themselves and there's almost no sort of communal connections. At least it feels that way. There are some, like if you look under the hood, there actually are communities thriving, but it doesn't seem like a lot of people. And if you look at the stats, like homelessness and drug addiction and death by drugs and suicide, it's pretty scary stuff. There's a lot of people who are mentally suffering from, like, they don't have a friend in the world, like you said, like 15% of males. That's a crazy statistic.
Yeah. I mean, we are more, and this is the irony of the whole thing, is we're more connected to more people than ever before, but we're more lonely than ever before, that we have any data for. Like, it is really the profound irony of our time is that these new technologies that are designed to give us community have really given us little of that. And I think it's really important to look into, okay, why are these not suitable? What is it not providing? It's giving us some sort of nourishment because clearly we use it all the time. It has its benefits, but it's not providing the connection, the deep kind of connection that we need as humans. And there is a question of maybe technology, maybe these platforms could evolve to eventually be able to provide it. But right now, it really doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about it a while ago, and the question I was playing with in my head is like, how does community happen? And I thought about the places in my life where it happens, and it comes about when groups of individuals are engaged in some shared noble pursuit. And so, like, on an extreme, an important level or more profound level, let's say the kid's school, community forms around it because parents are, trying to do their best in a very chaotic time. And the school itself is not there to create community, but it does as a byproduct of what's happening there, which is interesting. It's similarly like at my CrossFit gym. People go to the CrossFit gym because they want to achieve some, personal health goals or something. But what ends up happening is that through that shared suffering, you like these friendships form. And so I was wondering if there was if that was an empirically true thesis that you need some kind of noble pursuit or shared suffering in order to create community. And technology, like designed by people in Silicon Valley, is never going to give you that. Is my theory.
I think that's so interesting. I mean, I've been thinking about what is community, what makes community, why do communities thrive? And I think shared suffering is a fascinating idea because it is true that, when people go to war, soldiers come back, the best friends they ever make are the people that they fought with, often. And I mean, we see this again and again and also in cultures all around, the world over time. For adolescents, you go through often initiation rites. So, and it almost always involves some sort of shared struggle with other people. Typically, it's like boys with a group of boys. So it's kind of like a fraternity. They have their own initiation rites. Why do we essentially create suffering in order to bind people together into strong networks of people? And I think you're right. You have some sort of shared mission that involves some sort of structured suffering. And it gives you meaning and it gives you purpose in life. Not to always go back to this, but with virtual life, when we just move our relationships on there's not that structure, that support, that kind of clear path to meaning and purpose is not there. And yeah, it becomes really hard to recreate. And I don't even know what that would look like in an online world.
Yeah. I was going to talk about this later, but I feel like we should just do it now, which is there's this really fascinating part of the book where you guys are talking about Durkheim's theory around rituals and this sort of social electricity. I don't know if that's the right word, but the idea that if you have the people together experiencing something, some kind of shared, whether it's suffering or whatever, shared meaning, that's the sort of way in which you can get connection. to form authentically. And that the problem with the online technology is that it's asynchronous. So like people are experiencing it at different times, and there's no physical contact. You're just looking at a screen. Talk a little bit about that and how that impacts kids, for example, as they're growing up.
Yeah. Maybe let me take a quick step back and just kind of lay out for your audience what the core thesis of the book is, and then where this ties in. Because Durkheim is one of my favorites. So as I said at the beginning, when we look at measures across many different domains, so from anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicide rates among adolescents, so among 10 to 19 years old, that's really what we're focused on in the book. Trends were generally steady, sometimes even improving, up to around 2010 or so. And then right after, we get this sudden surge of all of these different issues. And it happens for girls, especially very rapidly, starting right around 2012, 2013. For boys, it's kind of this longer, slower process, but it's really going up as well. And to put a couple numbers, rates of major depression more than double for both boys and girls just within that span of 9 years. Going to the emergency room for self-harm episodes among preteen girls, that more than triples now, including 2021 data. And I mean, suicide rates up more than 50%. So it's a really staggering increase, a really staggering change in mental health problems. And what we do in the book is we illustrate that there are two major trends that are causing this distress. And what we say is kids used to have what we call the play-based childhood, where all mammals play, all mammals need to play, and you do a lot of it. You're interacting, you are in a social web with other people, with other kids, and that helps you kind of wire up your brain into adulthood. And essentially what we did was we said, we're not going to do that kind of childhood anymore, and we're going to replace it with a screen that essentially we're going to have in front of our face all the time, 24/7. Recent Gallup polls show that teens on average are spending 5 hours a day, every day on social media, and upwards of 7 to 9 hours on screens per day. So it really takes out almost everything else that you do. And so what we argue is that between 2010 and 2015, we moved from a play-based childhood into a phone-based childhood. And so there are many different harms, many different ways that this impacts kids. One is just what happens when you lose that play-based childhood. And then there's all these different varieties of harm of the phone-based childhood as well. And you were speaking to this distinction that we make between the real world and the virtual world. And I believe this can help us understand why the virtual world is not sufficient for children and often for adults as well. And that has to do with, how did humans evolve to interact with each other? And so our communication was always synchronous. Right now we have, except for occasional glitches, we have synchronous back and forth conversation. It's not like, posting on Instagram or on any platform where it's asynchronous. You post, you wait, you get it back, and it just keeps going like that. Very different kind of interaction. We're talking one-on-one. There is an audience, that we know is watching us, but usually with everyday interactions, it's just you're talking to somebody else or a small group. Online, it's very different. You are essentially platforming yourself. You're communicating to somebody with an audience. So we're speaking one-to-many people. And that is the kind of conversations we're always having. So, and it's also, the virtual world is not embodied. So we have no physical touch, often lack of eye contact, all of the things in the real world, in the physical world that we do to interact is not happening virtually. And the final one is that relationships are very costly in the real world, where I can develop a friendship with somebody, and it takes a lot of work. And it takes a lot of work both to maintain that relationship and also to leave that relationship. But in virtual worlds, I can close my computer, I can block somebody, and essentially it's gone in an instant. And for those four factors really can help us distinguish between these kind of two different worlds. And of course, they sometimes blur together. But when you live in a world that is mostly asynchronous, disembodied, where you're speaking to an audience rather than with individuals, and you have a very low cost of entering and leaving social relationships, it kind of leaves you in this state of emptiness and disintegration. And that's kind of where the Durkheimian ideas come from, to pull it back there, where we're not experiencing that shared human connection that forms when you are with a group of people in person physically, where you have touch and eye contact and development. And when you don't have that, it leaves a profound sense of emptiness often.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've been thinking about this a lot because I started training martial arts maybe like 15 years ago. And then I've been introducing my kids to it because I've noticed this trend where people are so in that virtual world where there are no consequences. There's no real world consequences to like misbehaving or acting out or completely disrespecting another human being. And what I want my kids to know, for example, is that, well, there actually are consequences to that. And like, this is what that feels like. Like if you get, beat up, like that's a real consequence. Like if you yell at somebody in real life and call them a name that's inappropriate, that might be the consequence. So I'm trying to introduce them to like the idea that, the body is real and there are consequences and stuff. But I see so many people, even a lot of the kids around town, they live in the world of no consequences in their head. But the real world's not like that, right? Like ask somebody in Ukraine or, people trying to fight it out in Gaza. Like the real world is not anything like that. And it's created such a false veneer. Like that's why I think you get things like road rage, right? Like people don't think consequences for road rage, but sometimes there are, because somebody on the other end is a little crazy and they take it, they go all the way with it. But in my view, that is a direct consequence of this online life.
I think that's really interesting. And, as we increase one with anonymity, when we feel like, it's interesting to see when a lot of people are putting on masks at protests now and different things. It's as you start to perceive yourself as being more anonymous, we enable ourselves to do things that we would never do if people knew. And essentially the virtual world is just a sea of people wearing masks, and we have no idea who's who. And it creates all sorts of dynamics. And the other thing you said, which I think is really, really fascinating, is that in many ways there's a very high social cost of being online, but the cost is on other people. So we can say terrible things. There's no repercussions for our actions, but it really hurts other people. So there's little cost on the self, but our actions can really impact other people. Yeah. And that's a really interesting dynamic, because on the one hand, what we really focus on in the book is about the kind of cost that it has on other people. So if you have the knowledge that anything I say could be up for public judgment and I can be shamed, I can be ridiculed, you're going to stop taking risks. You're going to be more anxious. You're going to be more fearful. And that's really costly. But we didn't talk as much about what does it do to us when we're constantly judging and ostracizing and shaming people online? And how does that also lead to that you're talking about, this lack of accountability, lack of recognition of the way that we're impacting other people, which you learn through things like martial arts classes. Like, I think you're totally right. It's the give and take, and there's little of that online.
Yeah, it just doesn't exist. And well, let's get into the data.
Yeah.
You mentioned when you were kind of laying out the thesis of the book, these really concerning spikes. And one of the things that I found fascinating when I was reading um, the book is that the mental health issue that spiked up was confined to the areas of anxiety and depression. And these other disorders were basically the same, on the same kind of path without any measurable spike. Talk to me a little bit about that, and why you all think that that's the case.
Yeah, I think that so one thing to note is that as long as we've been measuring this, things like anxiety, depression are always more common than other kinds of disorders like bipolar or addiction, just especially among adolescents and young people. So, that is to be expected that those things are going to be much more prevalent. But what we lay out in the book is that, right, a very specific kind of problem started to emerge during this time, and they're called internalizing disorders. So, which are kind of variants of anxiety, depression, things around self-worth, things around that are focused inwards towards the self, and other kinds of problems. So, both the things like more extreme psychiatric illnesses or externalizing problems, which are more antisocial behaviors around aggression and fighting. Those have actually been on the decline, and so which is really interesting that we are becoming more depressed, more suicidal, more lonely, but we're not necessarily becoming outwardly in the real world more aggressive or violent. Now, during COVID, some of that changed a little bit, but now we're seeing those on average starting to decline again. Part of why this is important is because it can help us zoom in on what is happening and what is causing these changes, where what is it that's making us, what new thing came into the world at this time that pulls us inward, away from the real world, and creates a sense of isolation, of anxiety, of fearfulness, of body image issues. It really helps point us in the direction, and we make the case more extensively, but it really points to this new phone-based childhood where these are the exact kind of problems that we would expect to start to go up.
Yeah. And it's not just the phone. Like one of my takeaways from the book is that not all screen time is created equal. Where we grew up on screens, in our generation, like I watched TV all the time. It was a different type of screen. But it seems like from the data that we have, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like things like video games or television shows, they don't have the same negative impacts as social media does. Is that like an empirically true statement?
Yes, and I think the one of the ways to think about this is there's a famous saying is the medium is the message, where really thinking about how new technologies change our relationships with others. How does it impact us more broadly, not just what's the content that people are seeing? And so with the with our smartphones, let me just I'll lay out some of the features and the design that changed that have made it particularly problematic, and I believe that this can help us understand when and where video games can sometimes enter into a similar space. Where so in 2007 we get the iPhone, but it's relatively disconnected from social media. Like, I think you were able to access the internet, but it was generally slow. Not many kids had it. And then in 2008, you get the App Store. So now you have thousands of companies that are now able to put their own apps on your phone, easy to get. And so now you have all this competition to create really engaging and enticing applications. 2009, you kind of see some of the fruits of this, where social media adds in like buttons, retweet buttons, things become more viral, more exciting. And so you have that, and then you also get push notifications. So now you're starting to be able to get notified throughout the day, and you get these vibrations, which is essentially conditioning you to build this kind of relationship with your phone. And by 2010, you get the front-facing camera. So now we start taking videos of ourselves and of other people. And not only that, you have Instagram. That's exactly when Instagram comes out, and it's designed for the smartphone. Other social media platforms were not, because we didn't have smartphones at the time. And so the rapid change is happening here. By 2015, most kids now have a smartphone loaded with these social media apps that are hyper viral. They have a high-speed data plan, and now you're able to carry the internet around in your pocket 24/7. The change, it's the combination of all of these things that really radically changed the way that kids were socializing and living in the real world and also online. And that really is where the harms start to come in. So it's not just social media of posting and not posting. It's not just the phone. It's the combination of all these things, and especially the fact that, you know, when we had flip phones, we used flip phones to communicate with other people, eventually, ultimately, so that we meet up in person. Nobody just like wanted to type like for 10 hours on your little phone. But now you communicate to stay online. And this is also where I think that video games do come in, where in the past, you know, with previous forms of video games, it was mostly about, let's bring a group of friends together to play in the same room, versus we need to be separate in our own rooms with our headsets to connect with each other in these virtual spaces. And I think that that's the real change. It's like, how much is it pulling us away from each other versus how much is it pulling us together? And the phone has been just one of the most profound things to pull us away from the people around us.
Yeah. And you see it. You go to any restaurant at any moment in time, anywhere. Actually, it doesn't have to be a restaurant. It can even be a bar. And people will be on their phones sitting across from each other. And, you know, that's been well documented on the internet, I'm sure.
Yeah. And just to, you know, put a stat here, the average teenager gets 237 notifications every day. And, you know, one study found that just about 20% get more than 500 a day. And so if we just stick with the 500 number, that's like a notification every 2 minutes of waking hours. So we're constantly being pulled away into, you know, all sorts of things, the terrible news, drama, group texts, everything, where we are forever elsewhere. We can never be focused on one thing or one person. And that really has a real impact on, one, our ability to just concentrate and think. And second is to be able to be with somebody, to be fully present with another person. And we all know that it never feels good if you're talking to somebody and they're just looking like behind you. Like, we would never be okay with that. But that's essentially what we do.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask you about these three features. So the three that I jotted down when you were describing it, we've got the like button, we've got push notifications, and then we have the front-facing camera. So let's just go in order. Like, from a psychological, there's a fascinating part of the book about this. Maybe you can summarize, but from a psychological standpoint, what is so dangerous about the like button for young kids in particular?
Right. So, you know, fundamentally, having a like button is not terrible. It's the way that these things are playing out. What happens is that we have a public metric quantifying our own worth, right? That is seen by ourselves and by other people. And the whole interaction style of social media is that you need to curate some version of yourself or your life. You put it out for the world, and then you are asked to be judged by it. So it's a constant state of public judgment. And first, that's just extremely anxiety inducing, having to constantly be, you know, kind of managing your brand as a 13-year-old to be judged by your friends and a bunch of strangers. And second, it this quantification and then social comparison that comes with it. I got 3 posts, he got 10 likes. The constant awareness of your own value, of your own worth relative to other people has never been metriced like this before. And, Snapchat, I think they took it down. Thank God. They created this new feature where it was a solar system of your friends, and you got to see how far away are you from your friend, and you get to see all the other people and how close they are, right? It's taking things that we already do, but just magnifying it, visualizing it, and then having everybody be able to see it. And that's essentially what the like button does. And, adolescence, the thing that is most important is feeling like you fit in. And social media companies know this. They take advantage of that fact. And that's what these like buttons are all about. It's all about quantifying your worth and seeing, am I in, am I out? And it's can be brutal.
Yeah, totally brutal. And there's this formula that you guys mention in the book called the hook formula, where it's essentially like trigger, action, variable award, and investment. And it's sort of how you get people hooked. And I don't remember exactly, but it's whether the social media companies knew about the hook formula and deliberately put it out in the world, or whether it was someone who studied it after the fact and said, oh, this is what they did. But let's talk about that for a second. Like, what's the story there with that?
Yeah. I mean, what we know is that these many companies have psychologists on board. They understand the human mind from internal Facebook documents. We've seen there's an image of the book showing essentially the hook model in action, so that's chapter 5 of the book, if people want to look into that. So we know that they're using behaviorist principles of psychology in order to maximize the amount of time spent on the platforms. And the question to me is not, did they know? It's of course they're doing this because the incentive structure is to keep people on. So what are you going to do? You're going to figure out how do you build really strong habits among your users. And just to kind of lay out that hook model, because it is really interesting, I think a helpful way to think about it is just we were talking about push notifications. So if I just set up my social media account for the first time, I'm 13 years old, and I work on developing my profile, and I put out my first post, and then somebody likes it, and I get a vibration in my pocket, and then I look at it. So there's so that's the stimulus, and then I get it, and then I get reinforced by it. I see it, and I feel really good, and then I open up the app, and I see what's been happening, and then okay, I post again, and then I do it again and again and again, and we develop this very strong association where eventually I no longer need the vibration to go and check the phone. I just suddenly start to do it. And I think we all know that feeling. It's you develop this kind of association with the device, with the platform, and then it becomes so embedded within us that we don't need anymore to have that stimulus to get us to check. We just check automatically and often constantly throughout the day.
Yeah, absolutely. On the push notifications, you mentioned some like pretty staggering stats here on this conversation, but also in the book about, man, it's like hundreds per day for people. Who invented the push notification? Was that Apple or was that Meta?
That was actually Apple, because that was, it was a smartphone related thing. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the intentions were. Typically these things aren't made maliciously, but then they end up having impacts that just were not thought out. And rolling them back is really hard. Yeah, I mean, maybe this is a good pivot to where we can talk about some of the solutions that we offer in the book of how do we manage all this stuff, and especially for our kids.
Before we get into the solutions, which I think, again, just to reiterate, super optimistic. Like, we've got this problem. It's pretty staggering for young people, but there's solutions. I want to talk just for a second about the push notifications. Like,
Hmm.
one of the things that I did maybe 5 or 6 years ago, like, I had read an interesting article about, hey, here's how you want to, if you want to really like optimize the iPhone, turn them all off. And I've done that, and it sort of works, but I still sort of have wrestled. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I've still wrestled with picking up my phone, checking email, checking texts. I turned it off for everything, but I noticed like my parents and my in-laws, their phones are literally exploding all day long. And like, cause like they don't turn it off on any app. So like they have a news app, right? And like every time. And so I feel like that's probably what's happening to the kids, but what's been your experience with push notifications? Have you turned them off, or what's your story?
Oh yeah. Oh my God. My relationship with my phone is just like, I can't stand it. I just, whatever. It's so funny because it's like I delete Twitter or whatever, and then it's like, okay, I'm good. Now I'm like doing this with my email. I can't. I'm addicted to my email.
So
And
checking it over and over again. Like, did someone email me? Yeah.
it's really interesting that the dynamic plays out across all of these different platforms. The whole thing is that it's like we're it reduces all the friction that it takes to do the thing that we probably shouldn't do. It's like you can access whatever you want to watch. Pornhub, it's like literally it takes 2 seconds. You type in something. There's no friction, no space to be able to like set those boundaries. It just makes everything really hard. I'm bored or I'm stressed out from work, so you know what, I don't want to work on this essay. I'm going to scroll through Instagram. I'm going to go online shopping. Whatever it is that your kind of your go-to vice, it's just like sitting right there in your pocket. And especially with adolescents, when it's so hard for adults, when your brain is not even fully developed, especially your frontal cortex, which is all about regulation and emotional control, impulse control. When that's not fully developed, and then you have this thing that you can literally do anything, anywhere, all the time, it's really not helpful.
Yeah, I know. And it makes me really worried about the future, because a couple weeks ago we were on spring break, and I went swimming, and I didn't even wear my Apple Watch. I was like, I'm going to just go in the ocean and not have it connected to anything. And I was like, oh, it actually felt subjectively, like, materially different.
Mm.
And I was thinking about these AI wearables, or these brain chips. Like, I actually think that's a dangerous moment in humanity, because even though the phone has completely captured us, right? Like, if you look at the data, people are spending 40 hours a week on their device, if not more. And once you implant it, though, it's over. Then there's nowhere to go. Like, you can't even put your phone away and go swimming. You're stuck. And so I do think we're that quickly approaching a very important point in humanity's history, basically. Like, are we going
Wow.
to be able to free ourselves from, because what worries me is that we know, like, I don't think the social media companies are evil people and all that stuff. I feel like, maybe they made some choices that in retrospect don't look that good with respect to kids, but the incentive of our system is certainly not making them think about, like, hey, what is this really good for human beings long term to have a brain chip that's connected to the internet? So I'm a little worried about it, and it seems like it's coming soon. But what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, just the distance, like having like physical distance from things is valuable. And we've kind of put everything into one little rectangle, and it's getting closer and closer to us. And once we put it in our heads, I think it's going to make it that much harder to deal with things. And you know what? I think like it will also bring so many new opportunities and experiences that I can't even imagine. And one of the kind of the important points from our book is that we're not Luddites. Like we don't want to reject technology outright. The core idea is, what should our relationship to it be? How do we have technology be used as a tool, not as something that uses us? Right. That's essentially what our relationship has become, where we're not really using it for our own purposes. It's using us for its purposes. And also that all of these things may have a lot of use cases and benefits for adults who have, grown up in the real world, developed kind of the skills that you need to thrive, and are better able to handle whatever virtual kind of experience or world that we're going to move into. This is really a place where, for kids, we need to think about, when should kids be able to enter into that world? And we've kind of assumed that it's fine whenever. And, just in the UK, for example, I think it's about, what was it? I mean, it's over 50%, I believe, of kids 5 to 8 years old who now have a smartphone. Right. The age of getting a smartphone is just getting lower and lower and lower. And so, yeah, I think that we really need a massive rethink around these technologies.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about that. So you all in the book lay out a number of interesting ideas. Why don't we just run through them? Like, what is the recommendation?
Yeah. So we have, I think it's 4 chapters on solutions with tons of things for broken up by parents, schools, governments. But there are 4 main reforms, 4 simple things that we can all do that we think will make a really big difference. And to understand why we think these are so impactful, I just want to sidestep just a tiny bit into what are called collective action problems. And one of the kind of the key ideas that we want to bring forth in this debate or in this conversation is that parents and teens are stuck in a trap. Because everybody else is on these devices, is on Instagram. If you're 13 years old and you decide, I'm not going to join that world, you are at a pretty high social cost. You are ostracizing yourself from often your friends. And so what most kids don't do that, and they often beg their parents, please let me onto these platforms, let me have a phone. All my friends have one. All my friends are doing this. And everybody's saying that to their parents, and then every parent doesn't want to be the one to say, no, you can't do it. So everybody just keeps going along and it keeps happening. So this is the trap that we're in, and it's a collective action trap because for any one individual to choose not to do this thing, it's a very high cost. But the collective action solution is, if we all recognize that this is what's happening, we can change it if we work together, and then the cost essentially disappears and the benefits increase. And so here are the 4 reforms that we call for. The first is no smartphones until high school, where we get smartphones out of middle school. You can still have a flip phone, but if no middle schooler has a smartphone, then you solve that trap. No social media until 16 is our second norm. And then, as we were talking earlier, and maybe this was before the conversation, of just the importance of schools. Schools are such an important institution for both setting norms for our community, and that's where our kids are. It's an incredible place to implement a collective action solution. So phone-free schools, where we get phones out of the school day. At the beginning of the day, you put them in a phone pouch or in a locker, and you get them back at the end of the day. You've just created 7 hours where kids can be with each other in person, focus on their teachers, focus with each other, and not with their devices. And the final solution is that we don't want to just take things away, right? We're not just saying take away the smartphones, take away social media. We need to give back what we called that play-based childhood, the freedom, independence, responsibility in the real world. Because the core thesis of the book, I should have said this earlier, is that we've been overprotecting kids in the real world, but underprotecting them online. We need to reverse both of those trends. The last one is a little more complicated, more difficult to do at first. But those are the 4 big reforms that we call for.
Yeah, I mean, as a parent who has kids in elementary school, I can tell you that collective action problem is real, and it's much earlier than teens. Like, we're seeing it. My oldest is in 2nd grade, and I'm hearing from friends that this is already starting in like next year, 3rd grade. People are getting phones, and like there's parents have different rules around it, and there's exactly how you described it. It's already happening in 3rd grade, so that is years before the teenage years. And so I've had conversations with parents about like maybe we should just agree, like let's get the 2nd grade class together to agree to have nothing until they graduate, which is 6th grade. And when they move on to the next school, people can choose to do what they want. But I'm kind of in favor of that. I feel like a device with the internet has got to be like the most dangerous thing you could give a child in elementary school. Like I had on this really fascinating former Green Beret who's working on in a really dark space, this like child trafficking space, named Matt Murphy. And his foundation is called Sentinel Foundation. And the stories he told about like the new ways in which weirdos and predators can get access to children, it's through the phone. It's through iPads. Like that's how it's happening now, at least here in the United States. And so, and then,
I mean, just in the last year, I think 2023, there's like more than 10,000 cases of sextortion that happened to teens. I mean, it's really, no guardrails are set up, and there's a lot that can be done to solve this, but until either legislation is pushing it, there are a few bills out there that will really help, but right now there's just not, and it's not a suitable place at the moment for young kids to be on. This is where a lot of that kind of stuff is happening. And, so on our website, anxiousgeneration.com, we have a take action tab. And, for your listeners, if you want, you can sign up. We'll have a newsletter. We also have a Substack where we do a lot of writing. But we also have resources for parents, for educators, for young people, and like sample text messages, because the key idea is, can you either, within your school, you can get a pledge to go phone free, or, you and a group of your kids' friends' parents. So you get a group of 5 of you and you say, together, we're going to delay smartphones and social media together. It'll make it, I believe, a lot easier if we do it with a friend group. And then you say, okay, on Fridays, we'll rotate. The kids can come over to our house, to your house. You can have, that play-based childhood while also delaying these devices together.
Yeah, I think I'll make sure everybody has links to that, because I do think there's a ton of interesting, both in the book and obviously on the website, there's a bunch of them. There was 2 other policy ideas that you all floated in the book, which I think are worth mentioning for our audience, because they're something that maybe we could push forward to make a difference on in the legal landscape. One is around, one of the issues that we have today is that the social media companies have age limits, like you got to be 13, but they're not really necessarily forced to verify that in a credible way. So like anybody can basically set up a social media account. It's the way I understand it. It doesn't matter how old you are. So there's that one. And then there's another one that you guys mentioned around the increasing the age of digital consent from where it is today, which is 13 also, right?
Right. So, just going back, second ladder and then the first. So there was a bill that was passed, I believe it was 1998, called the COPPA, is the shorthand. And they set the age of what's called internet adulthood at age 13. They originally wanted it to be 16, but then lobbyists pushed it down to 13. And the idea was that this is when you can sign contracts with companies to give away your data, give away your rights. This was in the 90s. We didn't totally know what we were going to be building. But at this point, it's essentially what we want to push for is let's get it up to 16, where, kids can't just click a button and say, here you go, here's all my data. At least that there needs to be, parental consent there. It's crazy, the system that we have. And to the second part is that there is no actual age gating that's happening. You go onto any social media platform, you can create an account for within 2 seconds. You can be 8, you can be 2, you can be whatever. It's so easy. And it's the same with pornography sites. There really is no real age gating. And so that's another thing that we're really pushing for is, so there are a few different kinds of bills that are being considered both at the state level and federally. Federally, there is a bill called the Kids Online Safety Act, which is pushing for a lot of reforms around the design of these platforms, which we do think will make a big difference. So this is not really targeting the things we were just talking about, but what it is targeting is saying, if you're going to design platforms where kids are going to be on it, you have to have a duty of care in mind for kids. So you can't have things like infinite scroll or autoplay or push notifications. Like, we need to reset those foundations, and that would help solve some problems, some of the harm that's on there. But we still don't want kids spending 9 hours a day on these devices. There are also a bunch of bills being put out around, in Florida, they recently did one to raise the age that you can access social media to 16, and then really make it possible to enforce that, forcing tech companies to have to age gate, or else there'll be like real financial consequences to it. So there are many different bills, many different states and attempts to try to manage this. And so I really recommend that. Also, we have a lot of those resources so you can see the different kinds of policies on our website. But a lot of this can be done at the level of schools and parents. And, we really do want to see change at the government level to help, because it's very hard to do this on our own. But there's a lot that we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. The book's been out for a little bit. What are the social media companies saying about it?
So that's a good question. We have not heard directly from them, but as we have experienced in the past, and just generally, they have a few big studies that they like to point to showing that there is no harm of social media use and mental health. The evidence is either inconclusive or in the other direction. There's really no problem there, and that we're spending all of this money trying to make our products safer. That's generally the narrative that they put out. But what is just clear over and over again is that the harms just continue to increase, and little is being done to do it. We actually, on our Substack, just had a post by a Facebook whistleblower. His name's Arturo Bejar. And he documented that, in a internal survey that they did on Instagram, that just about 1 in 5 or 1 in 7, so 15% of 13 to 15-year-olds get an unwanted sexual solicitation, have gotten an unwanted sexual solicitation in the last 7 days. And he makes the case that this is one of the largest global scale events of sexual harassment ever. Because of what these products have enabled. And so it's clear that these platforms are not safe for kids, but the companies generally point to a few studies that don't show effects.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I have a small Instagram account, and even I have no followers basically on Instagram. And even ever since I've been putting out like clips of the podcast, I've been doing this for about a year, I get those every single day too. Weird ass accounts where they kind of hide it. And Instagram does a good job of like putting it in a separate inbox but there's nothing that would prevent me from clicking accept and starting to engage with those accounts if I wanted to. And so like you put that at a 13-year-old boy, like, or girl, it doesn't matter. They might be willing to engage with that account. And so that's a staggering statistic. I'm gonna have to check that out. You said it's on your Substack?
Yeah, it's on our Substack. It's at afterbabble.com.
Okay, cool. I'll make sure people have links to that. I saw some chatter online. I can't remember the source, but it sounded like it was coming from the social media companies in response to the anxious generation, to the book, which was, hey, this is correlation, not causation. What do you say to that argument?
Yeah, so lots to say about it, but I guess just to keep it brief, yeah, we have John, myself, Gene Twenge, the other researcher that we collaborate with a lot. We put together a bunch of responses to that argument. Plus, we have an open source Google document that's about 400 pages of what is happening to adolescent mental health since 2010, and another one that's looking at the effects of social media on teens. And one of the things that often happens is that when you look at what is the effect of social media on everyone or on every teen across every country, across the world, you don't break it down by gender, you don't break it down by anything. The effects are very small. But what we always find is that when we zoom in, when we look at girls, adolescents, especially early puberty, the effects start to get bigger and bigger, and it becomes much clearer that there is an effect. And so in these open source Google Docs, we lay out all the correlational studies. We lay out dozens of longitudinal studies, experiments, natural experiments, and there are studies on both sides, but we try to make the case that the evidence is pretty clear, that the preponderance of the evidence shows that there is a significant risk of harm from using these platforms, especially for adolescents and especially adolescent girls, where the risk of, there's this one meta-analysis of 26 studies that found that for every 1 hour increased use, there is a 15% increase of experiencing depression. And this is for adolescents, and that risk increases for girls as well. And there are a variety of studies that show similar findings, and those are typically omitted when this conversation starts. So there's all of this documented research, and then we also have all sorts of other kinds of evidence, of eyewitness testimony of what are parents seeing, what are teachers seeing, what are young people saying is causing their mental health problems. Repeatedly, we are finding that they are pointing to smartphones and specifically social media. And so you can see a lot of our responses and how there's a big debate that we're having with different people on this, also on our Substack.
Yeah. And it's tricky for sort of public intellectuals. You don't want to get deplatformed either. And these social media companies actually do hold quite a bit of power. Like anybody in that public intellectual world, like John Haidt, right? The author of the book and your partner, they are at risk. Like Jordan Peterson is a good example. Like love him or hate him, he says what he wants to say, and he's had all kinds of crazy experiences with YouTube and whatnot, and getting sort of canceled momentarily or deplatformed momentarily. So it is a real phenomenon. These companies are incredibly powerful and wealthy, and so to speak out against this stuff takes a bit of courage. So I appreciate what you guys have done, and I think it's an excellent contribution and something that parents around the world. This isn't just a U.S. thing too. I forgot to mention that earlier. This is like a global phenomenon. Anywhere where people have mass access to smartphones, essentially, right?
Yeah, I mean, so what we're finding is that the effects are clearest and happening, especially in the wealthier, developed nations in the world, U.S., UK, the Anglosphere. the Nordic countries, and that's a whole other kind of rabbit hole that we can go down into this international story. But what it is true that across many countries, we're seeing the same trends hitting the same kids. And so, yeah, in our book, we make the case that this is tied to this rise of the phone-based childhood. It has really been a net negative for kids in many areas around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't do a great job of talking about this other part of the book, but I think we should probably end there just to cover it, because as a parent, it's something that I've certainly thought about, because you've mentioned in the course of the conversation that it's not just the phone based life, it's the absence of other things and safetyism, like you sort of hinted at, this the safetyism culture. And I think there are some really important points around that side of the equation too, about reintroducing a play-based childhood into our communities. So why don't you just try to summarize that for us?
Yeah, thanks for that. As I mentioned at the beginning, all mammals need to play, and the human brain is really unique in the way that it develops over time, where our brains grow really quickly at first, up to around age 6, and then it just stops. And our body also kind of stops growing for about 10 years, 7 to 10 years. And that period is the period of childhood, right? It is this very unique time that evolution has given humans to do what? Like, what would be the evolutionary advantage to being this small-bodied weakling running around in the forest? Why not just continue to grow linearly like many other animals do? The reason is that we are a enormously social species. That is really what defines us. And the period of childhood is the period that we're really wiring up our brains to learn to be in a social group, in a society, and learning how to master skills. And the way that we do that is through play, an enormous amount of play. And the best kind of play is the one that's often unsupervised. You're out and you're with other kids in a mixed age friend group, and you're on adventures. And the reason why it's so beneficial is because you're learning how to navigate the social world. You're learning consequences. And like you were saying with the martial arts, I mean, it's a little different, but it's generally learning that give and take and play. And we need thousands and thousands of experiences like this in order to really develop and fine tune those skills. And both smartphones and social media and overprotection, where we're preventing kids from going out and having this kind of play that most kids had for most of human history, are experience blockers. We're preventing kids from having these experiences. Now, one of the reasons that it's so hard to give kids a play-based childhood today, first is like, we have cars everywhere and we're more disconnected, more isolated. And there are no kids out on the streets. So who are you going to play with? And so that's a big reason for, one, we need to create these tighter knit communities, and then solving that collective action problem by teaming up with the parents, with the friends of your kids' friends' parents to, provide kids with the opportunities to play with each other, to be together, without screens, without devices. So the core idea is that humans are mammals. Mammals need to play, and we need to play a lot. And that play needs to be low cost. So we're not being judged, we're not being metriced, and we're often unsupervised, and we're learning to self-govern ourselves. And the best way to do that is, having that free play, that time to go out and do stuff. It's not structured activities, which has its place, but a lot of play. And that's just a little slice of that part of the book.
Yeah, I think it's an important part though, because it goes hand in hand. And as a parent of young kids, I can tell you, I think the optimistic story is that it feels like the era of like the extremely extreme helicopter parenting is coming to an end, or may have reached like the peak, because I've noticed a trend just in our little small, like obviously this isn't empirically valid, but in our small data set, like parents are more open to that and less inclined to do the helicopter stuff and wanting their kids to have this autonomy and responsibility and get out there a little bit and take some risks. So I do feel like that trend looks like headed in the right direction, but it's a big issue. Like you guys mentioned in the book, stuff about like the child endangerment laws. Like this got so ingrained in our society where people were leaving their kids at the park and then getting like criminally prosecuted for child endangerment for leaving their kid in a park, which what does that say about our society if you can't do that? Like, isn't that what the park is meant for?
Yeah, no, I mean the collapse of social trust, the collapse of trust among other adults is a major problem that we need to find ways to feel comfortable. And like, again, the key idea of the book is overprotection in the real world, underprotection online, where we're missing where the real risks and dangers are. They're really not happening in the way that many of us fear in the real world. And we believe often that these devices, the kids are in the house, but they're experiencing things that we don't want them to experience. And so we got to reset those dials a little bit. And for your listeners, I suggest checking out letgrow.org. This is an organization that John co-founded with Lenore Skenazy, and Let Grow is amazing. They have all of these different programs and initiatives designed to help parents and help families and schools increase that kind of the play-based childhood, much more independence in the real world, giving different kinds of things that you can do. So letgrow.org, highly recommend.
Yeah, I've been checking it out myself since I discovered it in the book, and it looks awesome. And I'll make sure to include a link to that.
Great.
Well, cool. Well, I'm going to put something out into the universe because I find it to be super fascinating, which is when you guys get ready to write the book about the democracy side of this, I want to be involved in that in some capacity.
All right, it's on the record.
All right, cool. Either promoting it or doing some like interviews or whatever, just because I feel like a large part of my work creatively and this podcast and my newsletter has been focused on what I see as a crisis essentially in democratic function. Mm. And it's driven by a lot of the things that we talked about today, ultimately, the attention capture and the self-oriented nature of society. But I feel like it's coming to a head, and it's like the biggest elephant in the room in America, which is like, guys, are we certain that this thing is even functioning? That's the question that I've been asking myself. And I can't say for certain whether it is. And that's scary because we're supposed to be in a democracy. And so I feel like I can't wait till you guys start working on it, and excited to help out if there's anything I can do. So,
of course. Thanks, Nick. And if your listeners haven't read it, one little taste of some of the work that we're doing on this is a piece in the Atlantic called "Why the Last 10 Years of American Life have been uniquely stupid," and John is speaking much about this issue. But we'll keep in touch, and I'll let you know how things are going. Hopefully things don't get too crazy, but we'll see.
Yeah, man, we got 6 months to find out how crazy it's going to be. I'm a little concerned. This college campus stuff is like a preview of I think what's possible later in the year.
Yeah. But on a positive note, there is a lot that democracy is going to be it's a hard thing to fix, a hard thing to get right. But there's a lot that we can do to improve the lives of our kids. And so just those 4 reforms from the book: no smartphones till high school, no social media till 16, phone-free schools, and trying to give a little bit more of that free play, independence, responsibility in the real world. These are things that we can all do. Parents, schools, young people, and it will make a big difference. And so I hope that your listeners enjoyed this. If they have any comments, questions, just reach out to me. But thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, Zach, thanks. Really enjoyed this conversation. I'm looking forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, same.